Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to make a little video about the gravamen, when to file one, when to take a silent gravamen, and choosing to believe. Some people noticed over the last little while in my videos, I would often talk about a silent gravamen. And some people got the sense that that was sort of lying or duplicitous, where you have a confessional difficulty or a difference with a confession, a difference with the stated belief of the church, and so you just keep silent rather than going to your local council and going through the gravamen process or the new gravamen process, something like this. And I've now also heard some talk about submission and what submission means with respect to confessionality and the gravamen process. And people have approached me individually now and then asking about gravamen, and they would share some of their beliefs and tell me what they think, and they would ask if they should file the paperwork. And now, of course, with Synod making the decision that gravamen is not sort of like an exception to a confessional standard, what should they do? And I've often mentioned that many people will just take a silent gravamen. And what do I mean by that? Because that's obviously not an ecclesiastical term. And for me, this sort of comes to the fore with the question of submission. Because submission is when we voluntarily submit ourselves to the belief of the church. Now, this gets into this question of belief and what it is and what we experience and how durable our beliefs are. The real downside to recording outside is, all of this. I think one of the things that arises is sort of a fantasy about how belief works. It's a fantasy that, in my mind, there's kind of an on-off switch with respect to nearly every conceivable belief. And that for any conceivable idea or notion or belief related to Christianity, that I somehow have in my mind and in my heart an opinion about everything, a strong conviction about everything. And that just isn't the case. Part of what happens over the history of the church is that people have all kinds of questions that arise socially, culturally, philosophically, religiously, doctrinally, that the church takes stands on here and there. And some might be deeply related to content in the Bible, and others might be much more related to what's happening in a particular culture at a particular time, with respect to the church and the Bible. And so things get written down, things get explored, and sometimes those things find their way into confessional statements. All of the confessional statements of the Christian Reformed Church arise out of particular social and historical contexts that may or may not be the same. And so ideas get written down that may or may not relate to us. And in fact, there can be a large amount of there could be many ideas that arise in confessions that we just never really bump into or even fully understand in the way that they were understood historically at the time a confession was written. This kind of thing happens all the time. The confessions might be addressing questions that an individual living centuries later never themselves bump into or have concern about, or necessarily even find to be germane with respect to the text of the Bible. Because in the case of the Reformed confessions, one of the things that when you sign the covenant of office bearers, you state is that you believe that the confessions agree with the Word of God, meaning the Bible, but meaning more than the Bible, because the Word of God means something a little bit more than just what is written in the text. It means, Jesus, of course, is the Word of God, and the Bible is the Word of God. So, Protestant doctrine sort of talks about that in that way. Now, what some people imagine confessionality means is that you've read the confessions, you fully understand them, and because you've read the confessions and you fully understand them, you fully agree with them, meaning that there's not a case when a thought or a notion or an opinion or an idea just pops up in your mind and you say, I wonder about that. Now, every time you sit and read through the confessions and you have a thought that says, I wonder about that, you shouldn't go and to your counsel and just say, I have a difficulty because I wondered about that. Well, I can wonder about all sorts of things. I'm sitting here wondering about whether or not I should have made this video outside. I can wonder about how much money I'm spending in anticipation of this trip of Italy. I'm wondering about how much money I'm going to spend in this trip of Italy. I wonder about how all of the all kinds of wonderings flow through my mind. There might even be some wonderings that are fairly durable. They become anxieties and they become doubts and they become these kinds of things. I think for many people in the church, let's say they have a notion about, it could be, the ones that always get mentioned right now, of course, are infant baptism or same-sex marriage or all of this, and they have wonderings about that. Should they file a gravamen? I think what a silent gravamen is basically submitting to the church. To say voluntarily in your own mind, I read this, I look around at what's going on in society, and I wonder, and I have questions. But you know what? For the most part, even though I have wonderings and questionings, I submit myself to the teaching of the church. That is, in fact, what churches desire and why churches teach and why churches are communities of faith, where individuals come to church and they voluntarily submit to it. Now, there might be a reason to go to the council to say, I need to file a gravamen because, and of course there's confessional difficulty gravamen and confessional revision gravamen, and the way Synod 2024 has sort of set this up, you begin with a confessional difficulty gravamen, and unless you sort of resolve it, it ends in a confessional difficulty gravamen, it ends in a confessional revision gravamen where you try to convince the church to change its teaching. And I think those two things are part of a whole in terms of someone's experience in their heart of their belief and what they do. I think you file a gravamen when you come to the point of saying, because of my conscience, because of what I believe, I do not feel it's appropriate to submit to the church. Or I have sort of a settled conviction in my heart that is in opposition to the church, and I'm afraid that this is somehow going to challenge the church or be in opposition to the church. I think it's perfectly legitimate to take, again, what I call a silent gravamen, where a silent gravamen says, I read through things and I have ideas and I have wonderings, and maybe I wonder about the same thing on a regular basis, but I submit to the teaching of the church. And when asked, I express the teaching of the church. I choose to believe. And that brings up for me a couple of clips that I'm going to play now. One is from Ayaan Hirsi Ali when she's talking to Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins comes along and says, surely you can't believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali comes and says, I choose to believe. Now, what on earth does that mean? Again, I think this also bumps into our age of authenticity, where we sort of have this idea that my internal sense and compass must be the master of the universe, that I don't have doubts about this or doubts about that. And in Ayaan Hirsi Ali's case, it could be maybe she continues to have huge questions about the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. Maybe she has questions about the virgin birth. Maybe she has questions about the second coming. Maybe she has questions about all of these things. But now, as she has decided to follow Jesus, as she has decided to submit herself to the yoke of Christ and decided to submit herself to the church, she chooses to believe what the church believes. In fact, when someone becomes a member in the Christian Reformed Church, they have to answer a number of questions. And one of the questions basically asks, do you submit to the teaching of the church? Now, that doesn't mean you can somehow dispel any notion of doubt or question that is in your mind. What that means is that when you're asked, you say, what do you believe? I believe what the church believes. And this gets into the question of possible beliefs. I think some people now sort of in this back and forth over gravamen and confessionality take up this challenge of thinking that suddenly when someone becomes a member or an office bearer of the church, somehow they have to know all of the doctrines contained in the confessions. And even that statement, doctrines contained in the confessions, the confessions themselves are written statements. Now, that doesn't mean that you can sort of take the confessions and create a whole nother list of, let's say, doctrines that are contained in the confessions, because that's not necessarily such a discrete list. There are realms of ideas that could be sort of in alignment or not in alignment with confessions. Again, this is sort of by virtue of the way that ideas and reality work. They're always, in John Vervaeke's words, in sort of a transjective relationship. And so someone at whatever level of capacity they have, at whatever level of theological sophistication, they might read through the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, the Canons of Dort, the creeds, and say, yeah, that sounds right. I'll sign on to this. It doesn't mean that someone couldn't sort of pick at something and say, well, do you really believe this? This implies that, or this means that. In other words, someone could come around and sort of completely unseat, and then they would say, no, I don't know about that. And again, in sort of this fiction that I see sort of batted about sometimes in the CRC right now, that somehow I must fully agree with every possible implication of anything that is written in any of these three documents. No. What you do and how you deal with a world of complexity and the fact that nobody knows everything theologically, and in fact, no one has had time to come to an opinion at any implication of any line that is written in any document. What I think you do is that you say, I submit to the church. I believe these things because the church teaches me these things, and so I'm going to live my life in this way. And I think this normally happens all the time because churches change their mind. And what happens when a church changes its mind? Does suddenly everybody in their true, authentic selves, which is somehow monarchs over their life around them, they begin to say, well, the church changed its mind, I have to go and do this, or I have to leave because the church changed its mind? No, you submit to the church, and you submit to the teachings of the church. And in fact, I see this happen on a fairly regular basis. Sometimes in the Christian Reformed Church, we will do what are called, we'll do theological conversations with ministers from other denominations. Usually they're not far away from the Christian Reformed Church confessionally. We'll see ministers from other denominations come into the Christian Reformed Church. And sometimes they could be denominations that are very close. I can think of Korean Presbyterian ministers that come into the Christian Reformed Church. I've seen some lovely examinations with some Baptist ministers who come into the Christian Reformed Church. And when asked, obviously they're coming from a Baptist denomination and they come into the Christian Reformed Church that believes in infant baptism, they will always get asked a question about infant baptism. And what I've heard many of these ministers say in front of classis, and classis simply agreeing with them, is, I will submit to your teaching of the church. And I don't think they need to file a theological exception to that. I think what they do is they basically take what I've called sort of a silent gravamen, where they think, okay, well, yeah, I might think the other thing, but I'm going to live happily in the Christian Reformed Church, and I'm going to teach what she teaches, and I'm going to submit myself to the church. And I think this is, in fact, the standard situation of any believing person. I'll play another clip of Peter Hitchens when he had his talk with Elizabeth Oldfield. and he talked about choosing to believe. And I think one of the things that you do when you join a church or when you sign on to a confession is that you choose to believe. You choose to believe the beliefs of the church, and then you promise to support the beliefs of the church. Now again, at Synod they had all of this wholeheartedly agree. Now I think in sort of a very Martin Luther sort of way, you could have people of particularly sensitive consciences that sort of in a panic-filled, panic-stricken way, read through the confessions, trying to find something that, oh my goodness, here, I don't believe this line right here. What am I going to do? I need to run to my council and file a gravamen. And then what if after 3 years my mind isn't changed and I have to file a confessional revision gravamen? And oh my goodness, what if in all the years of process to that, the classis or the synod doesn't change? It's like, for Pete's sake, what kind of unreal situation are you setting up? For the vast majority of people, they're going to read through this and they're going to say, yeah, that sounds right. I agree. And someone might say, well, what about this and what about that? And they might say, you know what? Yeah, I might have notions now and then about this, but I submit to the teaching of the church and I'm going to take these beliefs and make them mine. And again, I don't find that very different from Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who, desperate in her situation to try to not drink herself to death, she basically runs to Jesus and runs to the church. And the church that she goes to, I don't know what church she goes to, and I'm not looking to find out. The church that she goes to teaches about the resurrection of Jesus and the virgin birth and the second coming and all of these things that are in the Apostles' Creed. And Richard Dawkins comes to her and says, well, surely you can't believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. And she says, I choose to believe. And what she is saying is that I am submitting to the church and its wisdom because I believe that the communion of the saints is greater than I am. And I believe that the confession of the church knows better than I do. And so while in my noisy little brain, I might have this thought or that thought, and I might even have some of these nagging thoughts and questions that I wonder about, my soul is calmed and my heart is relieved, and I feel that comfort and joy because I submit to the teachings of the church, the community around me, my brothers and sisters in Christ who very well may know more than I know, and I'm happily within her fold. And I think people in cases like that should not file a gravamen with their council. That's perhaps a topic for the pastoral conversation, let's say with your pastor or a colleague, but that's a very different thing than saying, okay, I've sort of come to a fairly settled belief that the church is wrong. So I'm going to, in the confessional difficulty gravamen, submit myself to a process to, let's say, discipline myself to the belief of the church. And if at the end of 3 years, I don't particularly like the timeline, maybe that will change, I don't know. Obviously, just like with all other confessions, what Synod has decided has arisen within a particular historical time that may or may not prove in the future to be a difficulty. And then go to the confessional revision gravamen, where I say, but I could even imagine at the end of a confessional revision gravamen, the person filing that gravamen gets to the point of saying, I've tried to change the mind of the church. I wonder if the church is right, but I continue to submit to the teaching of the church and will do so happily. I think that when you take again, reading the covenant of office bearers in sort of how would I say this? Reading the covenant of office bearers in a way that makes my chooser, my whatever it is in my head that comes up with theological notions and opinions about a full range of things, making that somehow the governor of my life and the governor of the world, I think it's absolutely normal within the life of the church to have an idea and to say, you know what? I submit to my people. I submit to my church. I submit to my God, because I am not the be-all and end-all theological chooser of the world. I have notions, I have ideas, I have conversations, and in fact, it's joyful to live in that freedom when I can have an idea, notion, or conversation, and it doesn't have to be the final theological judgment and decision of the world. I can have an idea and I can talk about it with someone, and they can talk about it back with me, and maybe I'll change my mind, and maybe I won't. That's the way life works. But when it comes to how I live, what I teach, what I do, I submit to the church. I submit to my people. I submit to my Lord. And I think that's what a silent gravamen is. When you simply come to that place that says, yeah, I might have notions and ideas. Notions and ideas come and go. But if you ask me what I think, what I really think, put that on. What I really think, we're not sort of putting the individual at the top of my hierarchy. What I really think, I think with my people. I think with my church. I think with my Lord. And while I might have questions, that's where I'm going with this. So that's what I think a silent gravamen is. I don't see it as sort of a dodge or a cheat or somehow disingenuous. It might be inauthentic, but let's not completely bow to a culture of authenticity. It may be the fact that I understand myself not somehow as this radical, heroic individual that stands against everything else, but I understand myself within a body, within a community, within a culture, within a people, within a tribe, and within the body of Christ. And so when I listen to Ayaan Hirsi Ali or Peter Hitchens talking about choosing to believe, that's what I hear. And I think it's absolutely legitimate. Now someone might say, yeah, but your people doesn't say that. It's like, well, again, I think in fact I am submitting to Synod, because I think if this particular aspect came up to Synod, I think I would be right. And then ironically, if they said, no, you're proven wrong, I said, well, okay, then I'll submit to what they said. And I'm still within the bounds of confessionality because I've submitted to that too. So yeah, those are my thoughts. And in fact, I couldn't have a YouTube channel if I didn't think this way, because I have all sorts of thoughts. And I'm sure if someone decided to go through 3,000 hours of video, both of after I started my channel after Jordan Peterson, and then maybe going through a whole variety of sermons that are early on before any of this that you can find on my channel, however poorly recorded, they would say, oh, look, here's a little thing where Paul disagrees with that, and now Paul needs to file a gravamen because Paul said this then. And what I would say to them now is, I choose to submit to the church. That's what I would say. I certainly may have been wrong. In fact, I could probably say with utter confidence, I'm sure I was quite wrong, because I'm regularly wrong on a whole range of things. And so in a world like that, I don't need to be the little center of the universe. I am embedded within a people of God. I am embedded within a theological tradition. I am embedded within a structure of authority, and I will submit to the church. So there's my answer to that. And I'll include a couple of those little clips, and that'll be it. As you can see, probably won't be recording videos from my office for a little while because I'll be traveling. And in the membership section, there'll probably be some really cool videos of great places. Maybe there won't be. I don't know. Kind of sound like Donald Trump. Maybe. I don't know. But we'll see. So yeah, just had this idea, and like my YouTube channel is, when I have an idea, I like to share it. And I hope this will be helpful for tender conscience office bearers that think, oh, I don't know, sort of in a Martin Luther way. And I would say, you don't have to know, just submit to your church. I know for some Americans that sounds inauthentic or somehow oppressive or old-fashioned to submit to the authority and the belief of the church. I think it's actually what happens when, of course, Thomas finds himself outside of the subscription of the apostles when they all say, "We've seen the risen Lord." And says, "Till I touch his hands and put my hand in his side, I won't believe." And then when he sees Jesus, he believes. Or the man who begs to have his son, a man who begs to have his child healed. And if you can, he says to Jesus, and Jesus is like, "If I can, help my unbelief." I think that's what we cry out to the church. So there's that. So yeah, leave a comment. Let me know what you think.
Okay,
and
so
people don't know. Well, the main thing people have to understand is that almost certainly the opinions they hold are not their own opinions. And the great Jonathan Swift's law: you cannot reason a man out of a position he wasn't reasoned into in the first place. I know this. Yeah. I've tried. You can't do it, and not many people have.
How do you think people come to their opinions?
They pick them up. They pick them up less and less from their parents, more and more from, certainly in the years when I was growing up, from television. That's the national sense of humor, which is now almost completely uniform, was provided by television, as far as I can see.
Right.
I don't actually find a lot of it particularly funny, but they do, and there you are. It's been a hugely conformist force in all the opinions that people hold about practically anything. And that's just now moved on to anti-social media.
Yeah, good phrase. One of the places people get their opinions from is columnists. Do you see that?
No, they don't.
Okay.
They go to columnists for reassurance about the opinions they already hold.
Right.
I think there are very few people who go to columnists to try and learn from somebody who disagrees with them. I just don't think that's what I do as a columnist. It's when I'm on Twitter that I tend to be engaging with people who don't agree with me, and generally who haven't read a word that I've said or listened to anything that I've said either.
Yes. Is it fair to say that an awareness of sin or human failings came before wanting to talk about God in the way that you do in this book?
I never wanted to talk about God.
No, it's a very hard thing to do, Will.
I don't want to do it. That book was wrung out of me. I didn't want to write it.
I'm sorry to be digging it up for you.
No, I did. Although I didn't want to do it, I did do it. It was published under my name. I must take responsibility for it. But it wasn't. It was very much. It was somebody else's idea.
It surprised me in lots of ways because of the kind of, the two-dimensional portrait I had was of, Christopher Hitchens, your brother, new atheist, banging away at that cause. And then you on the other side, the title even, just like going toe-to-toe on the intellectual arguments for and against God. Your first chapter is instead very much closer to the chapter I have written on God in the book I have out, which, given our different tone and positioning, I wouldn't necessarily have expected, which is talking about God is much more fruitful in poetry than prose. This is not something you're going to argue someone into. And you talked about it being something that we choose to believe and about the desire for there to be a God. Could you just say a little bit more about that position? Because it was really striking to me.
Oh, well, I don't see how you can avoid it. It is the existence of God is unknowable. Therefore, it cannot be, you can't attain an opinion on it through research or through knowledge. So there is only one way in which you can reach an opinion on it, and that is through choice. And choice is almost always driven by desire. It's not a complicated thing. I find that atheists object very strongly, with the exception of Thomas Nagel, whom I mentioned, to this formula, because they know perfectly well what I'm saying about them. And why would you want the universe to be a vast cosmic car crash with no reason for existing and no purpose for continuing to exist, in which everything you do is judged only by its immediate observable consequences? Why would you want that? It doesn't take much intellectual candle power to work out what I'm saying about atheists, does it? So they object they all say, no, I couldn't believe. I have no belief. And they try and attribute their unbelief to some external force. And I find, well, mollusks may have no belief and bricks may have no belief, but there's no human being who hasn't at some point or other considered the origins of the cosmos. They've considered it. They've decided they don't want it to be designed or created.
Yes, you quote Somerset Maugham early on in that season where you're a kind of rebellious teenage atheist of wanting there not to be a God because
it liberated him. He was fantastic. The book of Human Bondage is extraordinarily frank about that.
Yeah.
Maugham had many drawbacks, but he also had many strong qualities, and one of them was a severe honesty, I think, about himself.
Yeah.
And that plainly, of Human Bondage is plainly autobiographical, and that moment which he describes plainly happened to him.
Yes. And I guess I'm wondering then, having had a season of presumably not wanting to be a God, what changed and made you do want? That's a terrible sentence. What changed to make you desire there to be a God?
As I say, you can't. You find there are other things in life than your own immediate pleasure and satisfaction and ambition. But as I say, I will not go into the personal details of that. No. Even if I wanted to, it would also involve talking about other people who have no business talking about.
Yes.
Well, I must say, I've never met a vicar that I didn't like. I mean, they're always very, very nice people.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the stuff they believe is obvious nonsense. And you have to take the whole package, because when you talked about Jesus rising from the dead, you don't believe Jesus rose from the dead, surely?
I choose to believe that Jesus rose from the dead.
You choose to believe it?
Yes, and that is a matter of choice. And it's a matter, I think it has to go back to, is there something or is there nothing? And I think you start with, there is nothing. And yes, for years I agreed with you, there's nothing. But if you come round to the idea that there might be something much more powerful than we are, something that caused everything else, then something like Jesus rising out of the dead, or these other miracles, Jesus being born out of a virgin, for that higher power is not a big deal. But again, it's a matter of choice, and it is just different planes of perception. And I think here on this plane of perception, having been a former atheist, I don't think this is something we're going to resolve tonight or agree on right now.
Well,
and so that is where I think it's perhaps more interesting, even if you choose not to believe, to say, let's at least talk about the value of Christianity for today. I look at these universities, the most illustrious universities of the West, and you've all shared with me images of young women draped in kefirs, the symbol of Hamas, performing the Muslim prayer. And tell me if those kids are not morally and utterly lost. And Queers for Palestine. So while you and I and Stephen Pinker and all of those wonderful people were locked up in our ivory towers, let's ask ourselves what was happening on the ground, because in the last 6 decades, we pretty much demonized Christianity and the teachings of Christianity out of the public space, out of school, out of universities. And a vacuum occurred, and that vacuum is now being filled, as G.K. Chesterton said, not because people have come to reason, but because now they'll believe in anything. And there are very awful forces today out there that are claiming the hearts and minds and souls of these young students. And when you say there is nothing, you offer them nothing.
We're getting into the bigger political, cultural question. I just feel it's worth pressing one more time on this. What you said, agree to disagree, and I understand, having read Richard's letter to you, that literal belief is the bit that he can't get past. Are you saying that you don't literally believe those things. You talked about planes of reality. Is it that you see a beauty in those things and choose to suspend your rational judgment, or do you literally believe them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something subjective, and there's a choice. There are things that you see and perceive that a different person cannot perceive. Art, music. In fact, I think you do enjoy a great deal of Christian art and music. I will look at a painting by Pollock, and I will think my 6-year-old must have spilled all the paint on the canvas and run around. And people are crazy enough to pay millions of dollars and hang it on walls. But I've actually seen people be moved to tears staring at a Pollock. That is a plane of perception that is real, but it's also very, very difficult to measure. And it's the same the way you're moved by certain pieces of music. So the fact that I have faith, and I choose to have faith because of what I've experienced, is just as real for me as it is for the millions of people who believe. But for me, what is even more real is it's the story itself and the wisdom in that story, the morality that has come out, that has evolved out of that story, the internal debates of millennia long and everything that we inherited from it. It's just too casual to cast that aside. And when we've done it, I think we have caused ourselves a great deal of damage.
Richard, having heard that story, that moving story from Ayan of clearly how her conversion has helped her, and also she's explained in beautiful words the mode in which she believes it, do you still say you are not a Christian?
No, not at all. I came here prepared to persuade you, Ayan, you're not a Christian. I think you are a Christian. And I think Christianity is nonsense.